Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Perryman. Welcome to my living room slash classroom slash life because of the pandemic. I know things are not ideal right now, but I'm very excited to have you in class, and I'm hoping that this class will be something that you look forward to every week. So what follows this is our first video presentation of module number 1. And so the idea in this class, like you've read, is to do the reading out of the book, watch the presentation, do any of the activities, and then take the quiz, and then do the assignments. Now, everything is really low pressure in this class because I think we could all use a little bit less pressure in our lives right now. So the quiz, for example, is something that you can use your book for, use open notes for. It's an open book, open note quiz. And you can retake it as many times as you like too. So, if you don't get them all right the first time, it's not a problem because you can always redo it. I would be thrilled if everyone in the class got 100% on every single quiz. That'd be awesome. And then the assignments too, you can always correct them. And in fact, we have our weekly Zoom sessions on Monday and Wednesdays at 1, where we will be going over the assignments and I'll be helping you. So it's kind of like a flipped classroom kind of thing. So there's going to be a lot of guidance in this class from me. So my top priority, though, is to make sure that you get the most out of this class. So if you have any questions after doing all the reading and watching the video for me, you can bring them up in the Zoom session. You can always email me whatever you need, okay? And if things aren't quite working the way that you want them to work for this class and you think there's something I can do to help you a little bit better, I would be glad to do that. So just feel free to contact me, okay? But for now, watch this video, and if you do have any questions while you're watching it, take note and email me or bring them up in the Zoom session. And I'm looking forward to seeing you guys in person. All right, have a great night.
Hi everyone, this is the video presentation for module number 1 for Music Theory 1. We'll be talking about the elements of music and pitches on the staff and on the keyboard, so some really basic stuff. The objectives for this module are to define music, come up with a good definition for music, describe the elements of music, identify pitches on the piano keyboard by letter name and octave, recognize the basic symbols of pitch notation, which are the staff, notes, ledger lines, and clefs, and to be able to notate and recognize pitches on the staff. Okay, let's start with a definition of music. Now this might seem really basic because we all know what music is by the fact that we're musicians, but it is good to kind of get a standard definition so we all know that we're talking about the same thing. And it might reveal some interesting things that you haven't thought of before. So for me, the definition I usually come up with is music is an art form that uses sound as its medium. Now that might seem a little bit too general because, you might have things like a speaker, like if somebody's crafting a speech, right? That uses sound as a medium, right? But this is, I think, a good definition that covers a lot of different kinds of music, not just music that you're, most familiar with. Okay, so what that means is that we hear music when an object, in this case, what's here is like a symbol of a speaker, when that generates sound, okay, and that sound is vibrations in the air, we perceive those vibrations as music when it reaches our ear. Okay? And a particular thing to note about music, I say it's an art form because it is only music because it's organized. Okay, it's sound that's put into some kind of organization, right? It's crafted into an art. It's different than speech in that way, in that you have a musician or a composer or, somebody remixing something or working with sound, where somehow a human is involved in crafting this into an art, okay? And so if we're going to talk about music as using sound as its medium, we need to talk about what sound is. So sound has 3 properties. Pitch, which is just the idea that some sounds are lower or higher than others, right? So like this sound is lower in pitch than this sound. Okay? So pitches have a relationship to each other in that some are perceived as lower or higher than other ones. Okay? Duration is another property of sound. That's the idea that some sounds are shorter than others or longer than others, right? So on a piano, if you hold down the key, you get a longer note. But if you quickly hit the key and let it rise back up, you get a shorter note. Okay, so some notes are long, some notes are short. Okay, so duration. Another property of sound is its intensity, and that's simply how loud or soft a sound is. Okay, so I can play a note on the piano, and hopefully this thing's behaving itself today, that is loud if I hit it with a lot of force. Or it could be soft if I don't use a lot of force. Right? So some sounds are loud and some sounds are soft. Okay? So those are the three things about sound that musicians use to create a work of art from sound. Okay? So pitch, duration, and intensity. Okay? On a higher level, we also think about what are called the elements of music. And on this level, music has 5 general properties. And these are things that musicians study and try to perfect in their art. Okay? So one is the idea of melody. And that's simply, pitches and durations that all kind of work together to create something we hear as like the lead part of a piece of music, right? So a simple melody might be, right? Like those are just pitches, but they're organized in such a way that they have some kind of meaning, right? They feel like part of a whole thing. So that's the idea of melody. Rhythm is just the idea of the patterns that we divide time into, right? So something might have a fast sounding rhythm, right? If I go up a scale really fast, that's sort of a fast rhythm. You can also hear that as slower. Those are different kinds of rhythms, right? And that's mostly the realm of the duration of sound and how we organize that. Another element of music is harmony, and that's simply whenever you have 2 pitches sounding at the same time, that creates harmony. So if I have a single pitch by itself and I add another pitch to it, they work together to create harmony, right? Okay. Another aspect of harmony that the book goes into is this idea of tonal harmony, which means that different harmonies have a relationship to each other and create tension in music in order to create a sense that one harmony is more important than the others, right? And this, I can just play one chord, and you instinctively know that if I ended the piece on that chord, it would sound like the piece wasn't over with, right? Because that harmony that I'm playing has a lot of tension in it. It wants to lead to or resolve to this, right? And once you get that harmony, that last harmony I played, the piece feels like it's over, like the tension has been resolved. Okay, so those are ideas in harmony, and we'll be talking about that a lot this semester. Okay, another idea is timbre, and that's just simply the fact that some instruments have a different tone color than other instruments, right? So a piano has a different tone color than a trombone. All right, a violin has a different tone color than a flute. All right, so it's like the pitches are structured in such a way to create a different kind of sound from an instrument. Okay, so that's mostly just an aspect of instrumentation and instrument choice. We won't be dealing with that too much this semester. And then texture is the final element of music that people talk about. And that's the idea that all of these different things, the melody, the rhythm, harmony, and timbre, all work together to create an effect, right? An overall effect. So when you have more than one musician playing together, they might have different parts, right? You might have a musician who is playing an accompaniment to another musician who's playing a melody. Well, that accompaniment and melody is a particular kind of texture. You might have a chorus singing harmonies that seem to move together at the same time. that is a particular texture as well. Okay? So melody, rhythm, harmony, timbre, and texture. We're mostly going to be talking about melody, rhythm, and harmony for the first few weeks of this class. Okay? So now we need to get into the actual sort of music theory part of this. And the way we do that is we kind of focus on those properties of sound and talk about how they are used and expressed and explored in music. Okay, so the first thing we need to be able to do is name pitches. We need to come up with labels for pitches because it really doesn't mean much to hear this, right, without being able to identify it in a standard way. Okay, and we'll also talk about how notes are laid out on the piano keyboard because that's another great way to visualize the structure of pitches. Okay, so pitches are named with the first 7 letters of the alphabet, and because of weird reasons, which if you want to talk about it, I'll definitely talk about it with you, but some of these things in life you just need to take my word for. But for various reasons, the musical alphabet doesn't start on A, it starts on C. Okay? And so we use the letters of the alphabet to name pitches, and letters that are later in the alphabet are higher than pitches that are earlier in the alphabet. So if our alphabet starts on C, C is going to be our low note. Okay? And the note above that, we'll use a later letter in the alphabet and call that D. Okay, then we'll keep going. E, F, G, A, B. And then once we go up 7 steps, we run out of letters, right? Because I said we were only using the first 7 letters of the alphabet. We actually repeat the note that we started on, which is C. Okay? And that might seem a little strange, but it reflects the fact that those 2 notes, that lower C and that higher C, have a special relationship. And if I play them, you'll hear what I mean. Right? There's really no difference between those 2 notes in some ways, right? One sounds darker, the other one sounds brighter, right? So they're related, and to reflect that relationship, to make sure that we know that those 2 things are related to each other, we use the same letter name, okay? But they have a special relationship, which we call an octave, okay? So different pitches with the same letter are related to each other by an octave. And that word octave kind of sounds like octopus, right? Octopuses have 8 legs. And that's because these 2 notes are separated by 8 steps. Okay? So you can also think about it as basically octaves are just higher and lower versions of the same note. And we also have a way of identifying a particular octave because that becomes important as you study music. And what we do is we add a number after the letter. Okay? So like that lower C that I played, you might call that C1. It's not actually C1, but you could call that C1, and then the higher C you could call C2. Okay? So all the notes between the C's are given the same number. So C, D, E, F, G, A, B, those are all within the same octave. So we call those C1, D1, E1, F1, G1, A1, B1, and then when we get to that upper C, we call it C2. And if we kept going, the next note up would be D, but we'd call it D2. Okay, and we'd keep going. The next one would be E2, F2, G2, etc. Okay? You might be noticing that I'm kind of playing it in the wrong place on the keyboard, but this is just an example. All right? So let's talk about the piano keyboard. It's a really useful way to see this repeating pattern of notes, and we'll be referring to it a lot during this semester. So lower notes are on the left-hand side of the keyboard, and higher notes are on the right-hand side of the keyboard. And the pattern of keys on the piano reflect the repeating pattern of octaves we just learned about. So I'm going to put a square over every 7 white notes on the piano, and you can see that these are all pretty much, well, they're all identical, right? They all look the same. If you just look at that box, you'll see that they are the same. And it's just like when we had that repeating letter of C, D, E, F, G, A, B, right? So the piano itself shows you that repeating pattern in a visual way. So each octave register starts on C and ends on B. So the lowest note in all of these boxes here in these octave registers is going to be a C. And we know that each of those C's will have a different number after it. So the first one will be C1, the next one is C2, C3 is the next one up, then C4, C5, C6, C7, and then all the way at the top of the piano is C number 8. Okay? And then, as you know from what we just learned, everything within that box, within that octave register, is given the same number. So anything to the right of that C4 will also be a 4. So we'll have D4, E4, F4, G4, A4, B4, and then we'll start again on C5. Then we'll have D5, E5, and we'll keep going from there. Okay? Now, one location we want to keep in mind is the location of middle C, which is C4. All right? It's called middle C because it's in the middle of the piano keyboard. Okay, so we want to keep that location in mind as we learn more about music theory. All right, so now let's talk about notating pitches on the staff. Pitches are written as notes on a 5-line staff. Okay, and it's a little bit like a graph. So we can show that a pitch is higher than another pitch by writing it higher, upper, or higher on the page than other notes. Okay, and it's also a place where we can show the amount of time something lasts for. So earlier notes will happen to the left of the staff, and later notes will happen to the right of the staff. Okay, it's kind of like an XY axis. The book does a good job of kind of explaining that. All right, so all notes go on a line or a space on the staff, and the notes you recognize, I'm sure, from music. Notice I'm not putting any flags on them because we're not talking about rhythm or duration. We're just talking about pitch. So the note heads either go on a line or a space, right? And as you go up, so that first note I wrote would be this, the next one would be this, and then that note is lower, so it sounds lower. Okay? So it reflects where the pitches are relative to each other. And then any note that needs to go beyond the 5 lines is written on a ledger line, which extends the staff. So like that note there, that extends the staff, so we can hit that note. And then that ledger line extends it lower, so we're able to write that note if we need to. Okay? Now, you might think you know what those notes are, but you actually don't, because if you've noticed, there's no clef on that staff. The only way you can know the letter name of a note is if there's a clef at the beginning of the staff. Okay, so let's talk about clefs. There are 4 clefs commonly seen in music today. The first one is that guy, which is the treble clef, also known as the G clef. And if you kind of squint your eyes and use your imagination, it kind of looks like the letter G, maybe. So that's an interesting way to think about it. The circle on the clef tells you which line is G4. Okay, so you can see I've indicated where that is. And so any note written on that line is going to be G4. A note that's above that line, right, on the next space up, for example, will be A4. And then you can keep going. If we wrote another one above that A, it would be B4. All right? And then the space below that G is going to be F4 because you go down in pitch for notes below that. Okay? There's also the bass clef, also known as the F clef, which totally looks like the letter F, maybe. Definitely not. The dots on that clef tell you which line is F3. Okay, so any note written on that line will be F3. And then if you write a note, the space above that line, it will be G3. If you write a note on the space below that line, it will be E3, because E would be below F. Okay. Then there are 2 other clefs that we call C clefs that look the same, but they have different names depending on their location on the staff. Okay. And so the indentation on these clefs tells you where the note C4 is, also known as middle C. The first one is the alto clef. So shout out to the viola gang out there. And that, if it's on the middle line, we call it alto clef, and that tells us where middle C is. And then the other one that looks just like it is called the tenor clef. Okay, and that's on the second space from the top. Sorry, second line from the top. And in that location, we call it the tenor clef. Okay, you'll notice that those notes I wrote on there are, in fact, the same notes, even though they look different. That's because that clef is in a different spot. And that's actually how they were originally used way back when. So to avoid ledger lines, composers would often use a C clef to be able to kind of make sure that all the notes in the range of the instrument or the singer were all on the staff in order to avoid ledger lines. In our case, nowadays, I think they're not used that often. The alto clef in particular is only used by the viola. And then the tenor clef is sometimes used by a cello, sometimes used by trombones, but it is still good to be able to read those clefs if you need to. All right, so we have treble, bass, alto, and tenor. Okay, so there's one other kind of thing we need to know about called the grand staff. And the grand staff is whenever you combine a treble clef and a bass clef staff. Okay, those two things together we call a grand staff, and this is super important in theory. We'll be dealing with this a lot. It's really useful because the staves, which is just the plural of staffs, the staves overlap on the note C4, middle C. Okay, so if I kind of start writing notes going down from each location, so from that treble clef, G4, the next note down would be F4, then we'd have E4, then D4, and we'd eventually get down to C4. Okay, then if I went up from the bass clef, we'd have G3, A3, B3, and then we would get to C4 again. Okay, now that's really cool because they overlap, and the middle C kind of looks the same on both staves, right? So because it has that one ledger line, it looks the same, and we can see that as kind of an overlap. That's why pianists always know the location of middle C. And that's why it's so helpful in theory, because you can start seeing things in relation to middle C, right? It helps you find the location of notes. And that's exactly what you should think about when you're trying to do the assignment that's after this video presentation, at the end of the module, because it will be really helpful when you're trying to find the octave and the letter name. Okay? All right, well, if you have any questions about this, we're going to be using the online Zoom sessions to go over it, and also to help you with the assignment. So if there's something you didn't understand, that's fine. I would recommend going back and watching it, maybe writing down your question. You can also email me. I'd be happy to answer it. We could schedule a Zoom session. Any way that you want to handle that is fine. All right, so I'm definitely here for you to learn. This can be a little bit overwhelming if you're not used to reading music, but I promise you it'll get quicker and it'll be really helpful. Okay, so I will see you in our next Zoom session. Thank you so much for watching.